Romania was blessed to have King Michael, a man of such great quality as its monarch and head of state. Many outstanding attributes come to mind when we consider his historic significance and character, but moral rectitude and personal courage define him as a remarkable man and rightful king who opposed with all his strength the twin evils of Nazism and communism. The tragic destiny of Romania in the 20th century is the sad fact that his reign only covered a relatively short period of time. Were it not for misguided politicians and a cruel destiny, his reign would have lasted 90 years, possibly the longest in world history, and Romania would have undoubtedly been a much happier and more prosperous country. The king used to remark with irony that he was born in 1921, the same year when the Romanian Communist Party was founded. He was very proud that, contrary to expectations, he outlived the latter by a wide margin. With the benefit of historical perspective, how small and villainous were those who removed the king in 1947, persecuted him, and prevented him from taking his rightful place even after the fall of communism. By contrast, King Michael is today recognized and revered as the greatest Romanian of his century and will forever occupy an indelible place of honor in history. King Michael's first reign under a regency lasted from 1927 to 1930. With his father living in self-imposed exile, he spent his early formative year exclusively under the positive influence of his mother, Queen Helen. It's impossible to overestimate the importance of this exceptional woman in forming the king's character. She instilled in him his steadfast sense of duty, his moral values, and norms of personal behavior that guided him throughout his life, and it was she who encouraged his resolve and provided steady support during the many trials that the destiny had in store for him. King Michael's first reign was followed by the so-called Restoration of 1930, the return of Prince Carol to Romania, his removal from the throne, and his father's coronation as Carol II. What followed was a painful decade for the young Crown Prince, Michael. The relationship between his father and son was difficult from the very beginning and remained so uneasy until Carol's II death in 1953. Upon his restoration, Carol separated the Crown Prince from his mother and exiled Queen Helen to Florence, where she remained until 1940. The young prince was only allowed a couple of short visits each year to see his mother. From the very beginning, Carol II or his subordinates spied on him and read his private correspondence. Carol II was also very jealous of his son. Even late in life, King Michael often reminisced that whenever he excelled in some activity, driving or shooting for example, his father would try to prevent him from pursuing it. Not surprisingly, this marked King Michael's personality. He became cautious and somewhat taciturn in public. He learned at an early age to confide only in those close to him whom he could trust. His warm personality and sense of humor were abundantly on display with family and friends, but in public he was reserved. King Carol made a positive, if unusual, contribution to his son's education by creating a special school including students drawn from different walks of life and from various ethnic backgrounds, taught by outstanding professors chosen by the well-known sociologist and ethnographer Dimitrie Augustin. As a result, the young prince received a solid education that stood him in good stead for the rest of his life. Even after many years in exile, his conversational Romanian was impressively elegant, as was his detailed knowledge of Romania's history and geography. And speaking to the core of King Michael's character, childhood friendships formed during those school years lasted a lifetime. As the king funeral, one of the most moving moments was the arrival of Lasker Zamfirescu in his wheelchair, the last survivor of his school, who had come with tears in his eyes to pay his respects to his old school friend. King Michael's second reign, from September 1940 to December 1947, started with the rise to power of the Iron Guard, soon to be replaced after a bloody battle by the military dictatorship of General Antonescu. Without consulting or even informing the king, Antonescu entered into an alliance with Hitler and engaged Romania in the war alongside Germany, placing Romania in the invidious position of being at war not only against Soviet Russia, but also against its traditional Western allies. Antonescu's regime, encouraged by its Nazi mentors, unleashed savage persecutions against ethnic minorities, especially against the Jews. Thousands of Jews were deported to Transnistria, where many of them perished of disease and starvation, or were simply murdered. Queen Helen, together with the king's active support, intervened to stop the deportations and to repatriate those already deported. Together, they organized substantial shipments of food and medicine to Transnistria. In defiance of official policy, the Queen Mother and the King took major personal risks to assist the Jews. When their actions were discovered by Adolf Eichmann, they were threatened by Antonescu. They remained undeterred to save as many lives as they could. For their unflinching courage and humanity, they earned a special role in history. Indeed, in 1993, Queen Helen was posthumously enshrined at Yad Vashem as a righteous among nations. As often happens in periods of extreme darkness, there were also sparks of bright light. One such spark was the friendship forged during the war between King Michael of Romania and Romania's chief rabbi, Alexandru Shafran, a friendship that lasted until the rabbi's death in 2006. During the war, they worked successfully together to serve the lives of thousands of innocents. As fate would have it, in post-war, Shafran became the chief rabbi of Geneva, where King Michael lived in exile and where they remained in close contact. On 23 August 1944, at the age of 22, King Michael organized a successful coup against Antonescu, broke the alliance with Nazi Germany, and engaged Romania in the war on the side of the United Nations. World War II historians have acknowledged that King Michael's actions, both necessary and beneficial for Romania, shortened the war by 6 months. Bloody and destructive battles on Romanian territory were greatly avoided. The armistice, which was signed in Moscow in September 1944, although harsh and unfair to Romania, declared the Second Vienna Award, or the Vienna Diktat as it's known, null and void, thus opening the path to the return of Transylvania to Romania. The fact that King Michael succeeded in his actions on August 23rd is nothing short of astonishing. The young king acted almost alone, showing incredible presence of mind in fast-moving circumstances. His prestige and his trust and respect by the Romanian society explain why the Romanian army, without hesitation, followed his orders to oppose the Nazi troops and to expel them from the territory of Romania. When Hitler learned of the arrest of Antonescu, he instructed his subordinates to install a puppet government in Bucharest led by a general loyal to Germany. No such general could be found. By the time the Soviet troops marched into Bucharest at the end of August, the city had already been liberated by the Romanian army, and the government committed to the democratic values had already been installed by the king. It is relevant to look at the 23rd August coup in its historical context. In July 1943, the King of Italy attempted a similar action by arresting Mussolini, but then he vacillated. The Germans freed Mussolini, occupied Italy, establishing a defense line north of Naples, and the war continued on Italian territory with devastating consequences and loss of life until May 1945. In March 1944, in Hungary, Admiral Horthy attempted to break the alliance with Germany, but he failed, and the Germans arrested him and installed a brutal pro-Nazi government. The Hungarian Jews, who until that point had been spared, were deported and most of them perished. Subsequently, fierce battles on Hungarian territory led to massive destruction and death. In light of these events, we can only imagine what would have happened in Romania had King Michael hesitated or failed in 1944. Immediately after the successful coup, the king reintroduced the democratic constitution of 1923, but sadly, these actions and the defeat of Nazi Germany did not bring lasting freedom to Romania. Under Soviet occupation, during a 3-year period, a brutal Soviet-style dictatorship was gradually imposed and human rights were suppressed. Once again, with great courage and at great personal risk, King Michael opposed with all his strength the communist power grab. In the process of imposing a regime based on lies and repression, the communists feared and hated King Michael. The king was legitimate, popular, extremely principled, and courageous. In addition, he was young, vibrant, handsome, and even worse, from their point of view, he was greatly admired and revered by the overwhelming majority of Romanians. The communists recognized that King Michael was their main obstacle on the road to dictatorship. It took them over 3 years of maneuvering and persecution of King's political and religious supporters to be able to remove him. The king could not prevent a preordained outcome, but he did manage to delay it for as long as possible and allowed thousands of prospective victims to escape to free countries in the West. Under extreme Soviet pressure, on March 6, 1945, the king was forced to accept the puppet government of Petru Groza. However, he strongly opposed many of the measures the communists were trying to impose. In the summer of 1945, King Michael asked Groza to resign, and when Groza declined, the king initiated the royal strike, refusing to sign any documents produced by the government, thereby bringing it to a standstill. Massive popular demonstrations in support of the king took place, but they were brutally suppressed. Under pressure, not only from the Russians, but also from the Western allies, the strike finally ended in early 1946, after Groza made minor concessions. A free general election was promised. That general election took place in November 1946, but was neither free nor fair. Notwithstanding an atmosphere of intimidation, the election was won by the National Peasant Party and the National Liberal Party. Without hesitation, the pro-communist government blatantly falsified the results and declared victory. Faced with this gross violation of democratic norms, the king's initial reaction was to refuse to attend the opening of Parliament. He consulted with the British and the American allies, who refused to support him, and in the end, he had no choice but to be present, with death in his soul, as he later said. In his opposition to communism, King Michael knew that he was at great personal risk, but continued to demonstrate extraordinary personal courage. He was well aware that Prince Regent Kirill of Bulgaria had been killed by communists. He also knew that he could end up in the Gulag. Nonetheless, he was undeterred. We must also remember that he was under enormous Soviet pressure, and all had been abandoned by his Western allies. for various political considerations which are outside the scope of this brief presentation. As the dark days of December 47 approached, the king was the only man standing who was opposed to the installation of the communist dictatorship. Many of the politicians legitimately elected, prominent intellectuals, leaders of the church, had been thrown in jail or subjected to an extermination regime. The king was the only one remaining defender of the Romanian civil society, but in the end he was finally forced to abdicate under duress. He left the country in the early days of January 1948, just before the bloodbath started in Romania. Terrible and long years of exile followed. The pain suffered by King Michael, who saw his country devastated and enslaved, is hard to describe. In exile, the king showed remarkable dignity and fortitude. Often facing personal financial difficulties, he worked hard in various capacities to support his family. At the same time, he remained a focal point of the national resistance and did his best to organize a fractious in-exile opposition. In parallel, the slander machinery of the communist regime was working full-time on an industrial scale. No effort was spared to spread lies about the king. It was falsely alleged that he had left the country with trains of untold riches. Doubts were raised about his intellectual capacity. As we discovered later, despite the communist incessant propaganda campaign, most Romanians continued to respect and love the king. His true image continued to live in the memory of the older generation, and by their word of mouth, they passed it on to the young generation. It was very moving to discover, after 1989, that thousands risked their freedom in order to hide portraits of the king and other royal memorabilia. When it became possible, people were very proud to dust off their treasured mementos and put them back on display. Many were sent as gifts to the royal family and are now on exhibit on royal collections. After 42 years since the king's forced abdication, Romania's communist regime finally collapsed, providing the country with an opportunity to return to legitimacy by restoring constitutional monarchy that had been illegally removed. This would have ensured a quick return of Romania to the fold of civilized nations based on respect for individual freedom and sanctity of private property. Sadly, this was another missed opportunity. Not only was the king not restored to his legitimate position, but he was turned back at gunpoint when he came to visit his own country and to pay his respects at the graves of his ancestors. Today, when we watch the film footage of the king's attempts to come home to his own country, it is with amazement, shame, and disgust. In the face of despicable behavior by communist-trained officials, the king maintained his calm and dignity, confirming once again our admiration and deep respect for his singular character. Finally, for Easter 1992, the king was allowed a brief visit to his country. Over 1 million people cheered him with enthusiasm in the streets of Bucharest and begged him to stay. Fearful of king's popularity, and instead of respecting the wishes of the people, the government in power banned his return for another 5 years. In a show of magnanimity and in the interest of national unity, the king eventually forgave them. History, I doubt, will be equally forgiving. I was asked once if I ever saw the king angry or losing temper. The answer was an emphatic no. However, the king was often sad and disappointed. He was sad about the poverty prevalent in Romania at the time. He was sad about the eradication of the beautiful traditions of the Romanian villages. He was sad to see the absence of a rich intellectual life. He was sad to see the landscape mutilated by hideous industrial complexes. Most of all, he was sad because he couldn't serve as he wished. It was extraordinary to see this great man concerned that he had not done enough for his country. In 1997, the newly elected government invited the king to return permanently to Romania and re-established his Romanian citizenship, which had been removed by communists. At that time, Romania already had a new constitution envisaging a presidential republic. The Romanian people were never given the opportunity to choose in a referendum between a constitutional monarchy and a republic. Nevertheless, the king decided not to contest the constitutional arrangements. He was, of course, convinced that the constitutional monarchy was a better system of government, organically derived from the history of the country. However, the king's view was that it was not his or his royal family's role to advocate a certain form of government. His belief was that it is the role of the civil society and of the political class to do that, while the role of the royal family is to serve the country regardless of the constitutional arrangements. The king put his ethos into practice by working hard and with great success to secure the admission of Romania in NATO and the European Union. The immense personal prestige and respect for King Michael and the scope and influence of his European royal family provided advantageous international access not readily available to government officials, and put the king in the position to influence decisions in favor of Romania. After 55 years since his forced abdication, the king and his family returned in residence at the Elisabeta Palace. It was a symbolic moment and the beginning of a new period in the evolution of the monarchy in Romania. Within a short period of time, the palace became the center of a multitude of social and cultural activities. Here, the king and the royal family were able to receive members of other royal families and foreign dignitaries. In turn, they traveled extensively abroad, promoting the country's interest in a manner usually associated with the reigning royal families. Many beautiful royal traditions were revived, including the festivities of May 10, Royalty Day. These events were attended by many, proud of their traditions, who were eager to see the king and express their strong feelings of national unity. The king was well aware that in a democracy there are many political parties representing a range of opinions engaged in sometimes heated debates. He saw this as normal and beneficial. He envisaged his role as being above politics and promoting a common culture and a common system of moral values. He discharged his responsibilities as a brilliant unifier. He also prepared his eldest daughter, now Her Majesty Margareta, custodian of the crown, to take over from him at the appropriate moment. By the end of his life, he has laid the foundations for what is in Romania today a functional monarchy. In the existing constitutional framework, the royal house and its head play a central role in the civil society, and a monarchy at the forefront of social cultural life that is actively promoting the interest of Romania around the world. I was fortunate to have had the privilege of being in the service of King Michael and being given the opportunity to know him. The king was not only a great role model for me, but he was my hero. He was modest and courteous, and always treated everyone with kindness and respect, regardless of rank and social position. He was genuinely interested in the well-being of those who work for him. His punctuality was legendary and demonstrated his consideration and respect for others. I enjoyed many private moments with the king, which I cherish, including him sharing with me his in-depth knowledge and passion for his Jeep collection. On one of my visits to see him in Switzerland, his private secretary told me that the car and the driver would collect me at the train station. Much to my amazement, the car sent to collect me was driven by King Michael himself. This is the generous man that he was. When the king died on December 5th, 2017, and later laid to rest at Curtea de Argeș on 16th of December, a period of mourning and reflection followed, which gave the Romanian people the opportunity to express, very movingly, their love and respect for the king. It was a landmark moment, heavy with symbolism. The hundreds of thousands who came to pay their respects as the king was lying in state, or who attended the impeccably organized funeral service, were a vivid expression of the final rejection of the communist past and of the reaffirmation of traditional moral and religious values. The funeral was attended by senior members of Europe's most eminent royal families, heads of state and foreign dignitaries, testifying to the king's international prestige and their respect for this great man. The heartfelt outpour of emotion was overwhelming and uplifting. The country had not seen anything similar in nearly 100 years. Those of us old enough to remember the funerals of communist leaders know that the participants then were forced to attend, and their expression of sadness was fake. Not one person in the huge crowds that attended the king's funeral was forced to be there. They all came because they wanted to be present. Their feelings and emotions were genuine. Recently, rewatching one of the TV reports of the funeral, I noticed a young man speaking to a reporter. He said, "The king's death marked the beginning of his third reign." How true. Not a temporal reign, but an eternal one that lives in the hearts and minds of his people.